Hi, in this video we're going to talk about flatworms, which are the phylum Platyhelminthes. Before we can do that though, we have to talk about the larger clade of Bilateralaria. We've talked about sponges and we've talked about cnidarians. All of the other animals are members of the clade Bilateralaria. What this means is they have a number of important derived characteristics in common. So first off, they all have bilateral symmetry. Remember, that means that you can draw a line down the center and there's just one line for which they are the same on both sides. That's pretty important because it allows for cephalization. In other words, it allows the organism to have a head. So in an area where there is central nervous control as well as sensory organs. That also means that that animals now have sides. So there is a dorsal side, in other words, back side, ventral, belly side, and anterior and posterior, in other words, forward and backwards. Okay. Bilateral symmetry also generally provides for a more efficient movement. It also allows for more complex organ development. Members of the group Bilateralaria also are triploblastic. That's an important vocabulary term. Triploblastic means that there are 3 germ layers, in other words, 3 tissue layers. So that means the endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm. Remember, the endoderm becomes essentially the gut. The mesoderm is most of the other organs, including muscles, and the ectoderm would be the skin and the nerves. These are some pretty important concepts, so first let's pause to make sure you get notes, and then let's have a review question. The next several groups of animals we're going to talk about are protostomes. Recall that when we say an animal is a protostome, what we're talking about is how the embryo develops. Remember, protostomes, when they have the hollow ball of cells called a blastula, the blastopore folds inward to create the gut, and protostomes form from the mouth towards the anus. This next bit's in italics because you don't need to write it down, but I just want to remind you that there's more to being a protostome than just whether or not your gut develops from your anus or from your mouth. In the case of protostomes, it would be mouth. So that also means that when the cells are dividing in the early stages, they divide spirally, and it also refers to how the mesoderm separates to make the cavity. This is important later on, but again, you don't really need to write it down now. And when we talk about protostomes, another thing you don't need to write down because we'll talk about it over and over again, are that we're talking about flatworms, mollusks, segmented worms, roundworms, and arthropods. For the most part, there's a few others. So protostomes are divided into 2 clades, and the 2 clades are based upon how they grow. There's more to it than that, but for now, how they grow. So the first one, which is a little bit tricky to pronounce, is Lophotrochozoa. And Lophotrochozoa grow simply by getting bigger. Whereas Ecdyzoa is another one that involves molting because they have an outer coating. So we'll start by talking about Lophotrochozoa today. Lophotrochozoa are the clade made up of flatworms, mollusks, and annelids, among others. And again, I mentioned they grow without molting. And the goofy name Lophotrochozoa comes from some structures that they use when they're reproducing. So either they have a temporary feeding structure known as a lophophore, which is basically this thing on the left here, describes how it feeds during one of its life stages, or its larvae have cilia, and we call it trophophore. I don't expect you to know either one of those, so that's why it's in italics, you don't need to know it, but simply that it's a smaller clade within the protostomes. As we look here at our animal cladogram, we're looking at this group here. Again, that talks about the group here. On this cladogram, you'll notice that as we look at the group of Lophotrochozoans, we're talking about animals that have true tissues, that have bilateral symmetry. They also have 3 layers of tissues, or triploblasts. And then we're looking at this subgroup here. Let's take a minute and pause, rewind if you need to for notes, and then let's review it quick. For the rest of the video, we're going to be talking about phylum Platyhelminthes, which is the scientific name for the clade that contains flatworms. A really good example of a flatworm is the planarian, which is what's pictured at right. Now, flatworms have a couple of key features. As members of the group Bilateralaria, they have bilateral symmetry. That, of course, means that they exhibit cephalization, so they have a head. Notice they have this top part here. Additionally, Platyhelminthes exhibit protostome development. Now, having said that, remember that we talked about protostome development as how the gut forms, whether it folds in from mouth to anus or anus to mouth. Problem is, Flatworms don't have both an anus and a mouth. They just have one opening that serves both functions. And so flatworms also don't have a cavity. They are acoelomate, which all the other protostomes have some kind of a cavity. So when we say they're flatworms when we say that flatworms are protostomes, what we mean is that other stuff that I was talking about, the fact that they exhibit spiral cleavage when their cells are forming, and the fact that the mesoderm forms in 2 areas instead of 1. Again, I don't care that you know those components, but just keep in mind that flatworms are acoelomate, so they don't have that gut formation that we talked about. Additionally, I mentioned that flatworms are considered protostome because of the way their mesoderm forms. So that means that they have mesoderms. So flatworms and all of the other animal phyla that we'll talk about are triploblastic, meaning not only do they have endoderm and ectoderm like Cnidaria, but they also have mesoderm. Remember, mesoderm is, among other things, what develops into muscles. Flatworms, some of them are parasitic, so they don't have that much movement. However, those that don't freely move around in their environment, and even those that are parasitic do have some limited movement. In order to move, flatworms use a couple of things. So flatworms, as I mentioned, have mesoderm, so they have muscles. They also secrete a mucus, some of them, which allows them to glide on surfaces. And finally, they also have cilia. Remember, cilia are short hair-like projections that are on cells that allow them to move as well. Take a moment and pause if you need to for notes, and then let's review. I mentioned a moment ago that flatworms don't have a separate mouth and an anus. Instead, flatworms have a single opening for their gut, so they do have a digestive gut, but that gastrovascular cavity has just one opening, much like the cnidarians have. That one opening is in the middle of their body, and it features in most flatworms what we call a pharynx. It's a feeding structure that it can actually go in and out of their body, and it's basically their mouth. Many flatworms are parasitic, and so an adaptation to be parasitic is that you have to have some way to stay in your host. So a lot of them have hooks. Also, many of them have suckers that they can extract nutrients out of their hosts. Almost all flatworms have guts, but there are some that completely lack a digestive system at all because they are able to absorb nutrients that are already digested. So if you live in the stomach of if you live in the intestines of something that's already digested food in a place where the job of the intestines is just to absorb the nutrients, then you don't need to have your own enzyme producing structures. You just need to also absorb the nutrients. Additionally, flatworms don't have any blood. If you take a look at their gastrovascular cavity, which is in purple in this picture and darker blue or darker brown here, those that gastrovascular cavity have all kinds of fingers and branches that go out through the entire body, and so they don't need any kind of circulatory system to pump that around. Pause for notes, and then let's review. The more complex animals are, the more body systems they need to have in order to deal with their needs. And one of the body systems that we'll compare as we go through the phyla from here on out is their excretory system. So the excretory system serves 2 main purposes: to control their water content, so how much water is there too much or too little, and also to eliminate waste. In humans and in other vertebrates, we have kidneys that serve that function. In invertebrates, some of them have kidney-like structures, others of them have more rudimentary systems, and the most simple of those are flame cells. Flame cells basically work like this. They're connected to tubes throughout the flatworm, and on those tubes are these bulb-like structures. And in the bulb-like structures, inside of them are cilia. Remember, cilia are hair-like projections? And the cilia whip back and forth. When the cilia whip back and forth, it creates an image like a flame, hence the name flame cells. As the cilia are whipping back and forth, what they're doing is they're drawing waste and pushing them towards this tube. This tube then leads to pores that leave the body, and so they're able to filter their nutrients and expel any excess water and waste. So I didn't have the notes up while I was describing that, so take a moment and pause if you need to. With increased complexity and movement also comes a need for a greater nervous system than we saw in the Cnidaria. So they have two nerve cords, which is actually fairly common in many of the invertebrates. The two nerve cords run down either side of either lateral side, so side. And then they both sides tubes end at ganglia. So ganglia are like a simple brain. It's not as fancy as a brain, even though it says brain here, it's in quotation marks, because there's not as much control as a brain. But they are basically brain-like, basically a group of nerve cells that function in coordinating signals and dealing with sensory input as it comes in. Additionally, you may have noticed that planaria have eye spots, which is not true of all platyhelminthes, but many of them do have eye spots. Now, the eye spots don't have anywhere near the capability of ours, but they do detect light intensity and direction. Many planaria actually prefer to be away from light, and in this way they're able to sense that. Let's pause for review. Reproduction in flatworms, like many invertebrates, occurs both sexually and asexually. Asexual reproduction comes mainly in the form of regeneration. Flatworm regeneration is really neat and a really great example of how an organism that is cut into pieces can actually grow into two separate organisms. If we're lucky, we'll be able to observe this in labs, so I won't talk much about it now. As for sexual reproduction, flatworms, like many invertebrates, are hermaphrodites. Remember that hermaphrodites mean that they're able to produce both sperm and eggs. So they don't have any sex. They're not boy or girl. They actually can do both. And whichever one's eggs are fertilized becomes the mother, if you will, or in other words, the host for the offspring. So they have internal fertilization, and some flatworms exhibit a very unique behavior called penis fencing. We'll watch a video of this in class. They have a structure through which they're able to deliver sperm, hence the name penis, and basically they battle it out until whichever one is able to stab the other one and deliver the sperm gets to not have to bear the burden of bearing offspring. So we'll watch that in class. Last little piece to talk about with platyhelminthes is their diversity. Now, this slide contains a lot of information, and I really don't expect you to write it all. Get the group name, the class name, and maybe a fact or two about it, but it's not terribly important that you have the different classes. So the first off, as with pretty much everything we're talking about when it comes to clades, is there's not confidence that these are all one clade. So first off, we have tubular. They're free-living, and the planaria that I've been talking about is a great example of this. And the most important thing I would write down is that they are free-living, and they have cilia that help them move. And they're the ones that have eye spots. In addition to eye spots, they have other sense organs, like those that can sense chemicals and movement in the water. Of course, those are all adaptations of having a free-living lifestyle. You need to be more aware of your environment if you're going to move about in it. Planaria can be found in freshwater or saltwater. They can even be found in moist soil. Trematodia are all parasitic, and great examples of them are flukes, as well as the flatworm that caused schistosoma. It's a common disease. I shouldn't say common. It's something that we hear about a lot on TV because it makes for interesting stories with diseases. One of the kind of creepy things about them is they actually have the capability of burrowing through your skin, which is why it's really important that if you're in a place that might have flatworms, that you always cover your feet and you don't want them burrowing through the soles of your feet. Cystoda are also all parasitic, and a great example of that is what you see here, which is a tapeworm. Tapeworms are probably the most well-known human-infecting worm. And they're the group that don't have their own digestive system because they absorb the already digested food of their host. Most of them do have very advanced structures in their head for feeding off of their prey. And their sense organs are limited to just the larva because, of course, it's the larva that infect the host. The rest of the time, they're living inside of a dark intestine that doesn't need to have any senses. As we look at some examples of these, here we have trematodes. They're the ones that can burrow through your skin. You might get a tapeworm through eating infected meat. And so if we don't cook our meat, we have the potential of getting it into our bodies, and then once it's there, it can grow into a tapeworm. Dogs also can get it. They would get it from handling wildlife that's infected. Let's pause one more time to allow you to go back to record notes if need be and to review. That's it for our discussion of platyhelminthes. As always, make sure you come see me if you have any questions.